All right, welcome back. We're going to continue with our material. So where we left off, we were discussing the path that sperm must take when it's from its origins all the way to when it's expulsing out of the body. Remember, the mnemonic that I shared with you guys was 7-Up. It just goes through every single pathway. Remember, the N just stands for nothing. There's no structure in this case that is starting with the letter N. And then we talked about some of the glands that are accessory organs that help, especially when it comes down to the actual semen, the fluid that nourishes the sperm and keeps the sperm alive. So let's continue moving down. One thing to mention regarding that before we do get into spermatogenesis, which is the process of sperm creation. I'll just go down to here. Another big component of the semen, apart from it being a nourishment and some of the products of it, like the prostate fluid or the urethral fluid, having their own responsibilities, like coating the inside of the urethra, removing any acidic urine, energizing the sperm. Another major aspect is the vaginal fluids are very acidic to the sperm. Without the semen coating the sperm, it would in fact destroy a substantial amount. And this kind of plays up to something I was talking about a couple videos before, that the entire reason that a male ejaculate has millions of sperm, assuming it's a normal, healthy person, is because statistically speaking, the vast majority of those sperm will never even come close to the fallopian tubes, which is where the actual fertilization process occurs, where the sperm and the egg fuse. The vast majority of them are destroyed, eradicated, because to the female body, as we're going to learn as we progress forward, those are considered foreign cells. That's obviously, those are not cells that naturally belong in the female body. So those cells get destroyed and get targeted. And so for that reason, it is a numbers game. Genetically speaking, our species would not continue to exist if we didn't secrete millions upon millions of these gamete cells in the hopes of being able to procreate. And even then, there's still a lot of people that struggle with that process of trying to fertilize and trying to have a child. So it is something that is not guaranteed, even though the numbers are more aligned with the possibilities of that. So let's see what we see here. Process of spermatogenesis. First of all, if you see this suffix here, genesis, that's just telling us creation. So if you're someone who's more biblically oriented, especially like Old Testament type stuff, the first book is Genesis, which is supposed to be the creation of everything. But sperma, in this case, is telling us about, obviously, sperm. So here's what we see. Spermatogonia, which are basically these stem cell-like cells. We've learned this before as far as what stem cells are. These are just stem cells that have been slightly altered, so they've become what we call spermatogonia, premature cells, basically. Undergo rapid mitosis to produce more stem cells before puberty. So in men, a key distinction, and I mentioned this in our first video if I'm not mistaken, is that up until puberty, there are no sperm made. There are these spermatogonia, these pre-sperm cells, if we want to call it that, and there's a massive amount of them, but puberty has to happen before sperm are actually properly made. Moving on from there, we talk about a hormone that we learned back in endocrine system, so we've seen that before, FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone. FSH actually modifies spermatogonia division. One cell produced is going to be a sperm cell. The other cell produced is going to become a spermatocyte. So here's what happens. We essentially have this hormone starting to secrete. It's going to be secreted by the pituitary gland, if you remember, the posterior pituitary, sorry. Then it's going to move its way through the body, through the bloodstream, eventually affecting the gonads, in this case, the testicles in men. One of those cells, those spermatogonia, those pre-cells as we call it, just continues to become stem cells and stays at that level. Whereas the other, that's split from that division, that cell division, is going to become a spermatocyte, which that eventually becomes what we commonly know as sperm. Let's bring that back up there. Okay. So a little bit more about that. A little bit more on the processes of spermatogenesis. Primary spermatocytes undergo meiosis. That meiotic process is something you should have learned very, very well back in biology. remember, with regards to meiosis, it's similar to mitosis, where the whole job is to split the cell and make two cells from one. The biggest difference is that with meiosis, you are splitting the cells, but you're also splitting the chromosomal count. As I mentioned in a bell work, the whole idea is that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 total chromosomes in our cells. A haploid cell or a gamete cell is going to have half that count, so 23 chromosomes. And again, this is all biology type stuff: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, etc. So these haploid spermatids are then produced. And then finally, what we see is the actual cell being made. So spermiogenesis is when these spermatids become proper sperm, as we refer to them. Now, as far as sperm structures are concerned, they're really straightforward, right? They're just kind of balloon shaped. So we just have something around the lines of that. And typically in the middle, there would be a little motor, otherwise known as the mid piece. So simply put, the head is going to have the DNA. That's the most important part, right? It's covered by a special acrosome that just protects the coating of this region. But literally, when the sperm fuses with the egg, everything apart from the head falls right off. The tail is just there for motility. So the tail works like a rudder for a boat. If you've ever been on a boat before, how it can control the direction in which it's swimming. Then the mid piece, this little square piece that I drew here, would be like a motor. It's generating energy for the sperm to swim. That's usually what you'd expect to see in your prototypical sperm. Now, here's the thing. Again, if you think back to biology, our cells are constantly replicating, some much faster than others, right? Like blood cells, for instance, and skin cells. There's an expected issue that will happen out of our control, mutation, where you have these DNA replications, these mitotic divisions, et cetera, and occasionally there's a problem. The good news is, the vast majority of time when your body has these problems, your body also recognizes there was a problem. So it deletes those things. The immune system does a great job of doing that and catching these issues. Now, it doesn't always play out like that. So for instance, in this case with the sperm, there are millions of sperm that are made. There are times that sperm can be made mutated. Multiple tails, for instance. So there have been many cases that you'll see a sperm. Let me go back to here. Hold on. You'll see a sperm that has multiple tails coming out of it, something around the lines of that. Obviously, when stuff like that happens, it can't control the direction it's swimming. It just kind of swims in a circle. There's been instances with what we call chimera sperm, where they have multiple heads. That's obviously not functional. It's going to weight it down as far as its ability to swim properly. So that does happen. And the good news is this: just like the female ova have a window of time that they're more fertile and healthy, same thing happens with male sperm. Men, the biggest difference is that they do make sperm for the rest of their life up until death after puberty. But as you get older and older, those sperm do start to have higher rates of mutation. So it's not exactly a free pass or anything like that. You do have to be careful as far as the sperm of that age, that could cause higher risk of genetic malformations. So again, this whole process, not a bad idea to know this. I'm just going to go ahead and underline this for us. This whole process can be up to 64 to 72 days. So again, as I mentioned in a bell work, we discussed that there's a location in the male reproductive system that is going to store the sperm and mature or maturize the sperm. If the seminiferous tubules in the testicles is where the sperm is made, well, this location where the sperm are going to be maturing and finally become their full-grown cells was the epididymis, the comma-shaped structure that sits on top of it. All right, now we get to start transitioning to the female reproductive system. So we kind of front-loaded a little bit more of the male reproductive system. It's generally speaking a little bit more straightforward, just a bunch of tubes connected in the sense of one way in, one way out. But with the female reproductive system, it is a little bit more complex. There are more steps happening. And what you'll notice is that there's actually a lot of similarity too. And we'll discuss more about that as we progress. There's a lot of interesting, unique similarities that can be predated to when we were developing the womb, regardless of the sex you were born with. So what are the major structures we need to be aware of? We have the ovaries, we have the duct system, we have the external genitalia. The ovaries are going to be the gonads, 2 ovaries in women, just like there are 2 testes in men. So remember, we're starting to see some similarities. The ducts are the tubes, right? We have the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes. We have the uterus, which is technically a tube, but it's just a large region, which is where the baby would be formed during the trimesters of development. And then the vagina, also known as the birth canal. And then the external genitalia, technically speaking, that's going to be the labia, as the labia is on the outside, and also the vagina as well. We don't get too far into the external genitalia, not as much as more of the internal structures relating to the female reproductive system, but they do play an important role as well to the health of the female reproductive system. All right, so just like what we did with the men, I'm going to underline or circle the structures that we need to be aware of regarding the female reproductive system. Not everything here, but quite a bit we do need to be aware of. So first and foremost, you're going to see some of these like ligaments, like suspensory, ovarian, round, etc. We're going to talk about that more as we progress. These ligaments help to hold these structures in place. You don't want organs internally, including the female reproductive system, to just be floating around and causing too much damage or potential damage. So we want to keep everything in place. So first of all, we of course have the ovary. We have 2 ovaries, but in this case you're seeing 1 since it's the side angle. The ovaries are like these egg-like structures that are being held in suspension. Then we're going to have the uterine tube, also known as the fallopian tube. So I'll just go ahead and circle that one for us. I'll circle this. There you go. I tend to call them the fallopian tubes. That's more the common vernacular that you'll hear. We have this other structure down here, which I can try to clear up a little bit of space for that. We have what's called the fimbriae. The fimbriae are these little finger-like structures which are going to hold the actual ovary in place. So they're the ends of the uterine tubes, and they're just kind of holding the ovaries right in isolation. We're going to skip these ligaments for now. Like I said, we're going to talk about them later. We have the uterus. The uterus, like I mentioned, is where the baby itself is going to develop over the trimesters, and where the fertilized egg is also going to attach itself. We'll learn much more about the uterus as we progress. There are certain regions of the uterus that we'll talk a little bit more about, like the fundus in the body. Don't have to worry about the bladder because that was a urinary organ, but you can see the proximity, right? Which, speaking of, one of the major side effects, as we'll learn way later on, of pregnancy is you start having to urinate more often. And it makes sense. If the uterus region, this whole area, starts to expand dramatically as the baby grows faster and faster and faster, well, guess what? That just means more pressure on the rectum on the backside and the bladder on the front side. So it makes sense that these are expected side effects while you are pregnant. The pubis, similar to what we saw in men, it's just a bone found in the pubic region. Don't have to worry about that. Urethra. We don't need to worry about urethra for female because, as we learned back in urinary system, it is strictly a tube for urine in women. Whereas in men, it can be for urine and also for the expulsion of semen and sperm. Vagina, we will circle that. Like I said, it is the birth canal. So in the late 3rd trimester, that's where the baby is going to exit from, assuming there are no complications. These are the external genitalia that we were mentioning earlier, like the clitoris, the labium minus, and labium majus. We don't get too in depth with that, but again, they play an important role for the health of the female reproductive system, but we're just not going to get too crazy with that. On the left-hand side, sacrum, that's a bone, right? You can just see where the end of the spine is, so you can get a good idea of where all these structures are. Coccyx is the tailbone. Once again, don't have to worry too much about that. Broad ligament, we're going to learn a little bit more about as we progress. Cervix, I do want us to know. So cervix is going to be the entrance to the womb, or the uterus as we call it. So it is that little region at the end of the vaginal canal. And then lastly, rectum and anus, those are digestive organs. So we don't need to worry about that. So overall, not bad. A little less than the male reproductive system as far as like specific structures. And we haven't talked about the ligaments just yet, which we will. But not too terribly bad overall. There's another perspective that you're going to see that commonly is referred to as like the deer antlers, where it's coming out to both sides. We'll see that coming up as well. But just like our other units, I think it would be a good idea just to review this, try to draw something similar on your side, just so you can label the basic structures, because on the test you will have both the male and female reproductive systems to have to recall. Okay, so that's where we're going to finish for today. Appreciate you guys checking in. Stay tuned for the next one.